This is just going to be a brief summary. Just going into the summary and conclusion from the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This chapter talking about the historicity or accuracy of the New Testament original documents. Now, let's see here. We have much more to investigate regarding the historicity of the New Testament, but we can draw two major conclusions at this point. Number one, we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents. Point A. While the original New Testament documents do not survive or have not yet been found, we have abundant and accurate copies of the original New Testament documents. Many more than that for the 10 best pieces of ancient literature combined. Moreover, nearly perfect reconstruction of the originals can be accomplished by comparing the thousands of manuscript copies that do survive. We have discovered manuscript fragments from the early 2nd century and perhaps as early as the mid-1st century. There are no works from the ancient world that even come close to the New Testament in terms of manuscript support. Point B. Reconstruction is further authenticated by the thousands of quotations from the early church fathers. In fact, the entire New Testament, except for 11 verses, can be reconstructed just from their quotations of it. Let's see. Second conclusion. The New Testament documents are early and contain even earlier source material. Point A. Since the New Testament documents are referenced by other writers by about AD 100, they had to have been composed before then. Point B. Since the New Testament documents speak as if the temple and the city were still standing at the time of their writing, and there is no mention of the onset of the Jewish war or the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, most of the New Testament documents are probably earlier than AD 70. Point C. We have very strong evidence that Acts was written by AD 62, which means that Luke is even earlier. Point D. We have source material that goes back into the 30s. Nearly all scholars agree that the death, burial, and resurrection testimony found in 1 Corinthians 15 comes from the time of those events or within a few years of them. Furthermore, there are at least 40 other creeds in the New Testament that appear to be of very early origin. So the documents are early and the sources are even earlier. But that's not enough to prove historicity beyond a reasonable doubt. To prove historicity, we need to be sure that these documents really contain eyewitness testimony. That's the question we'll investigate next. So this is just the summary that I got while I was reading through this chapter. It's actually some very interesting stuff. They point out... they begin this chapter here by pointing out some of the non-Christian works that actually reference the non-Christian works that actually reference the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, whether they believe it or not. But it was causing quite a stir at the time, and they referenced it at a fairly early period in time. Then they go on to compare to the 10 most well-known and best preserved historical documents from the same age or similar era of ancient world. And they find that by several orders of magnitude, the number of copies of the New Testament is ridiculously higher, or at least I should say manuscript copies. There are no originals left of any of these documents. So we have the number of manuscript copies of the New Testament was 5,686 copies. Now, the next closest would be the manuscript copies of Homer's work, 643 copies. Then we have Demosthenes, 200 copies. Herodotus, 8 copies. Plato, 7 copies. Tacitus, 20 copies. Caesar, 10 copies. Pliny, 7 copies. And now going in the approximate time gap in years between original and first surviving copies, we have the New Testament, approximately 25 years. Homer, 500 years. Demosthenes, 1,400 years. Herodotus, 1,400 years. Plato, 1,200 years. Tacitus, 1,000 years. Caesar, 1,000 years. Pliny, 750 years. And as for, let me see here, we have some other things. Well, let's see. Okay, so Josephus was he wrote Antiquities, He referenced several important events related to the gospel, such as the death of James, the brother of Jesus, in AD 62. And let's see, he describes the incident in this way. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, so he, Ananus the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Now we have another word where Josephus was referencing the resurrection. Let's see, he wrote these words. At this time, the time of Pilate, in brackets, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Now, what is important about this is that he wrote this after the, only shortly after the war that led to the destruction of the temple. So we have very striking evidence that the Gospels were actually not inaccurate. They are referenced, and the events that they reference are referenced in documents that are ridiculously early on. They are incredibly accurate to the order of something like 90-something, like more notably accurate than any other documents from ancient history. And I'm going to be getting into the next chapter once I've actually gone through some more of this book. This actually is a remarkably amazing resource book for apologists. So I encourage you to check it out if you'd like. Again, the title, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, by Norman L. Geisler and Frank Turek. Alright, well, you all have a blessed day, and God be with you in all things, and I'll be back for the next video.